So I'll just try to use the concept of binding it. So instead of giving the values directly or the ID of that particular component, that is the property ID property, I will just use. So I'll just use public course ID. So I'll just take it as course, some course. I'll just try display course ID is equal to. So I'll just tell ANG01. So that is the course ID, what I just wanted to change. Okay, so how do I bind this particular property to the element here? Okay, so I'm just giving it public course ID is equal to Angular ANG01. So now I'll just go to the HTML template. So here I just wanted to bind the ID of this particular element. So what I'll do here is I'll just tell, I'll use whenever I'm using property binding. So for interpolation, you will be using double curly braces. For property binding, when I'm using the square brackets. So I will just use the square brackets for property binding. So I'll just which property I want to use? I want to use ID property. So input ID is equal to. So what is this ID I'm using? I'm just giving course ID. That is the course ID which I have declared here. So I'm just giving the course ID. So here I had declared the course ID as this. And here I'm just using the input type course ID, type is equal to text, value is equal to this. So this is how I'm trying to bind it. So now I'll just see this. So if I just go to this part of it. So you can just see here. The ID is being binded, ID ANG01. So this is how dynamically, if you wanted to bind the property of a particular element, you can just use this part of it. So like this, you can just use property binding. So similarly, if you want to bind this particular element by using interpolation. So if you would like to use the concept of interpolation, fine, you can just use this particular concept. So let me take.
Ma'am, excuse me.
Yeah.
Ma'am, the square bracket is used to bind from source to view.
What, ma?
Ma'am, the
From component to template.
Similar to source to view, because we are using it in a source and it will display on a view site.
See, you have the property value in the component. From you are passing the data from the component to the template.
Okay, ma'am.
See, this is the component. So in the component, wait. This is the component. In the component, you have given ANG01. So this data, you are passing it to the template. So how are you passing? By binding it. What is this? Where are you passing it? You are passing it to the property. That is the reason it is called as property binding. See, I'll tell you, I'm explaining once again. I have declared a variable. So let us take like this. There is a variable called as course ID. So course ID is equal to ANG01. Where you have written in a component class. So that is employee component class. You have written this property. So now you wanted to bind this property to the template. So this is only one way. That is from component to template. That's all. So where are you binding it? So you are binding it where? You are binding it to the property of this particular element input. So every every element of HTML tag will have an ID. So you are binding this particular property, that is the property of a class, to a HTML element. To which one you are binding? You are binding to a attribute. So what is that attribute? It is ID is an attribute of this element. So I'm just giving in a square bracket, ID is equal to course. So this is a property binding. So still you have doubt? Now, if you have doubts, please clarify, because tomorrow you should not carry this particular doubt to the next session.
No doubts, ma'am.
Clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Clear.
ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so you are binding it to this particular property. So to bind this to this particular property, I have used a square bracket. One more method, I'll just show you how to use it. Okay, so I'll just take the same. So here I'll just give only one more text box I'm using. So let the text box be there. What is the mistake?
BR10.
Break. So now you have one more component. I have one more element I have taken. Input type is equal to text, value is equal to Angular. So here I want to use interpolation to bind it. So I'll just give ID is equal to. So here I am trying to use the concept of interpolation. So what is the course ID? So here I'm trying to use this, binding it with course ID. So here you can just see that in the previous part of it, I am using ID is equal to course ID. This where I am identifying, binding it to the property directly. So I'm using square bracket. So here I am trying to bind it with interpolation. So I'm just using this interpolation double curly braces. So ID is equal to double curly braces course ID. So now you can just see this. So when you inspect it, you can just see ID is equal to this. So when you inspect it, you can just see here ID is equal to ANG01. So this is how you can bind the properties. So now, for example, the next part of it is I just wanted to disable this. So how do I use the concept of disable? If I want to disable something, what I need to do?
Disabled attribute.
Disable.
So I should use disable attribute. So if I just give disable, I should give disable or disabled?
Disabled.
So disabled. So you can see that this is disabled. Correct. So this part of it has been disabled. Okay, so now the same disabled, if I just wanted to use disable, so now it has been disabled. So I just wanted to give it as disabled is equal to false or something like that. So how do I specify that disabled is equal to false? So in that case, what I need to do is I need to use a curly braces for this. So I'll just use disabled. Okay, square bracket is equal to false. So you can just see it as false. Now if I make it as true here. So you can see that it is enabled here. Okay, so I can just use a square bracket here for the properties. Okay, then second thing is I just wanted that if it is disabled, I want to make it as true or false. If it is disabled, then it should be there. So I wanted to use a property for this. So if I would like to use a property for this, so how do I use it? So what I'll do is I'll declare one property here. So I'll just tell public is disabled. Is disabled is equal to, I'll just make it as true. So I'll just give it as public is disabled true. And here in this component, I'll just make, instead of giving true here, true and false, whatever it is, I will just make it as is disabled. So this is what is this is disabled? Is disabled is nothing but it is a property which I have given in the class and I have assigned it to be property true. So now this particular property I am binding with the element for the property, for the attribute which is called as disabled. Here it is an attribute. When it comes to the HTML, it is attribute. When it is in the TS, it is property. Okay, so now I am binding that property here. So now I'll just see, you can see that it has been disabled here. So now if I just change it to false, here what is happening? Now it is true. So you can see that it is enabled here, disabled, it is true. So it is disabled it. If I make it as false now, what else happens? So now it is disabled. So you can see that it is disabled. Now if I just make this as false. So when I make this as false, you can see that it is enabled. So now I can make the changes. So now again I'll make. So here if I just make the changes to true. So you can just see that it is disabled. So like this, I can use the properties to make the changes. Fine. So I can use this properties change for any of the attributes. So for example, if I have an image, I have one image, image src, that is nothing but the source, and then I have alt, which is an alternate name. Okay, so if I would like to bind it here, I can just bind here. I can directly give the image link here, or what I can do is I can create one property here and assign the path of that particular link and then call that particular link here also. So that is also possible. So how do I do this? In that case, I should put a square bracket is equal to here the path of that particular image. That is the property name. Property name, which I have specified in a component class, I can write it here. So similarly for alt also. So like this, I can just bind it. So there is one more method. If I don't want to bind it like this, so what I can just do is I can if I want to remove the square bind, then I can just write bind hyphen disabled. So this is one more method. So like this also, I can use it. Where is, okay, this is because of this property name.
Alt attribute is grading problem.
Equal to. Okay, so you can just use bind disabled. So how exactly you can bind the property by property binding? One is you can just use square brackets and you can just define it, right? Declare the properties within the class and assign the value here, and you can just use a double that is square bracket, or if you want interpolation, you can just use interpolation, or if you want enabled and disabled, you can declare as a property and use it, or you can just give bind, the keyword bind hyphen disabled. So this is one more method which you can try to implement. So in this way, dynamically, when you would like to give some assign or bind some properties, you can bind it. So whenever you are using interpolation, remember that you need to use curly braces. When you are trying to use property binding, you will be using square brackets. Okay, so now if you want to bind a property, that is, you want to bind an object to a property, how do you, which attribute you can bind it? See, I have an object. The object is having the first name and last name. So I declared an object where the object consists of first name and last name. So I wanted to bind it to a attribute. So which attribute I can bind it?
Placeholder.
Placeholder. Okay, placeholder. And apart from placeholder, anything else?
Name.
Name. Okay. If I want to display, I want to display it, then what I should do? I want to
Value.
display within a division.
Value.
I want to display within a division.
Inner HTML.
So I will use div inner HTML. I'll bind it to inner HTML. So div square brackets, it is within square brackets, inner HTML is equal to that object what I'm trying to bind it. Good. So understood now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
So any queries on property binding?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, there are 3 ways of binding here. So is there any difference between them apart from the syntax?
Which one you are asking me about?
I mean, there are 3 ways that we can put the ID attribute in square brackets, or we can use interpolation using curly braces, or we can use bind keyword.
Yes.
So is there any difference between these 3 apart from the syntax?
No, apart from syntax, we are not having much this thing. And one is you can use this bind disabled. See, here is when you're using the Boolean data type. Okay, so it is always better to use square brackets when you're using property binding. So why we are not suggesting this interpolation is, if you just wanted to only bind that particular value, you can use interpolation. But if you're using some Boolean value, interpolation will not help you out. Okay,
ma'am.
so keep in mind that when you are using some Boolean value, so like disable, true, false and all, in that case, Boolean will not help you out. Sorry, interpolation will not help you out. So in that time, it is better always to use a square bracket.
Yes, ma'am, got it.
Okay, so and one more thing is, when you are using the Boolean type, you can just use bind. Otherwise, you can just go for square.
Okay.
Okay, ma'am.
So under this
So
circumstances,
square bracket is our best option.
Best option. So when you just normal binding, if you are using, then normally if you want to just assign that particular value, then you can just go for even either square or interpolation. But if you're using some Boolean value where you would like to check if it is true, you enable it. If it is false, because sometimes what happens is we will be using it when it is true, enable this particular button. When it is false, disable the button. Such sort of conditions are there. In that case, don't go for interpolation.
Okay, ma'am.
Okay. So I hope this part of it is clear.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Clear.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, fine. So now shall we move on to class binding?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
So I'll explain you class binding, and then I'll give you some time so that you can try property binding and class binding. Okay.
Okay.
So you can work on it. So now what exactly is class binding? So generally class binding is nothing but it is concerned with our CSS part of it. So we have the dot selector and hash selector. So whenever we are using that in CSS dot selector, we use class. When you use hash selector, we will be using ID. Okay, so this is where exactly your class binding also will come into picture. So dynamically, if you are trying to change some formatting features of your content or something like that, then you can just go for this class binding. So yesterday yesterday when I was just explaining you about the access bank. Okay, So you might have noticed that the color of that, when I click on it, the color used to change based upon the tab what
थोड़ी
I
दिक्कत हो
used
रही
to
है।
select. Yeah. So certainly, but that is dynamically it is changing. So if you want that dynamical part of changing some formatting features, then you can just go for class binding. Okay. So how do we generally use the class binding is, so what I'll do is, I will write the content that is CSS in employee component.cs file. So I'll just use one div. Okay. So for div, I'll just use class. I'll just write text color. So here I'll write.
No,
Any doubt?
no ma'am.
Pardon me? Any doubts you have?
No, no, ma'am.
No ma'am.
Okay, so now I just took this part of it. So now if I just wanted to implement this. So generally, how do I implement it? So I'll just use some H1. So H1 tag, I'll just write walking tree. So it is just displaying in a normal way. Now I want the color to be given to this. So I'll just use class is equal to text color. So you can just see that the color is being changed. This is a normal method, what we are trying to implement it. So now I just wanted to bind